Dr. Gillon, I have a handful of questions from core participants. They will inevitably span a variety of topics that we've discussed earlier today. First of all, reflecting back to when you were training and when you worked within the gastroenterology service, you said in your evidence that there was a general lack of popularity about guidelines up to the 1980s. Why do you think that was the position?
I think it was something that, in fact, was discussed yesterday with Dr. Moore about clinical freedom. And I think a lot of us didn't like being told what to do or what to think. And it took a wee while to get out of that mindset, I think. I must admit I shared that to some extent. But, of course, ended up writing guidelines, as you do. So I don't think there was any sinister connotation to saying that people were resistant to it. It was just that practice changed hugely in quite a short period of time.
Before your appointment as consultant in charge of donor services, who was responsible for that work?
On an interim basis, I think Dr. McClelland was taking that on himself largely. There was a gap of about a year and a half, I think, from the previous incumbent to me. And the feeling was that that incumbent had been a young haematologist who didn't find that she was satisfied with working in the donor service without having what she considered haematological experience. And so she went off to Canada, and Dr. McClelland and the other consultants were, I think, keen not to appoint a haematologist because inevitably they would want to do haematology. And that was difficult to reconcile with some aspects of the donor work in particular.
When we spoke about donor selection and donor sessions, you talked about staff at donor sessions suspecting someone might be gay or otherwise unsuitable to be a donor. What guidance was given to staff to make those sort of decisions?
It's something I addressed in the training sessions and frankly discouraged making those kind of decisions in favour of asking the donor the relevant questions and making sure that they understood the questions and gave them the opportunity in terms of privacy and so on to do so.
When you said that the culture in Glasgow stemmed from the top, do you mean that culture came from Dr. Mitchell, or were you referring to something else?
That's very hard for me to say. I got on very well with Dr. Mitchell, and he was greatly respected. I wouldn't like to say too much about that. I think it was just that they rightly felt they were in some ways different from the other centres and had particular problems, which they did because of, as I mentioned, things like logistics and size and lack of control of what happens once the blood went out of the donor centre or out of the components lab. So they had a different perspective, but it wasn't a perspective that was nimble in the face of things like HIV. I wouldn't put it any more strongly than that, I think.
And then in relation to the HIV, HTLV3 look back, how many HIV infections by blood or blood component transfusion are you aware of being identified by the look back across Scotland? Was it the 18 which was the number given to the Penrose inquiry, or was it less than that? That might be something you can't help us with, Dr. Gillon, but the question is put in relation to the national numbers.
I think that 18 was the relevant number, and if I remember correctly, 10 of those were in Edinburgh. I think there was one who had been reported. Maybe I'm thinking about a different set of numbers there. Yeah, I think the 18 was the total number that we identified.
Do the problems you experience, things like lost records, with the HIV look back, mean that the numbers identified would simply be a minimum number of infections caused by blood donations received in Scotland?
In a word, yes. I think it would be. There would have been one or two probably missed, I would think. But it was less of a problem with the HIV look back because it didn't extend backwards very far. I can't remember exactly when the earliest transmission was. It was something like 1982, I think. So I don't think we had the same scale gap as we had when we looked at HCV, where, as we saw, it was really quite enormous.
And in relation to the hepatitis C look back, you spoke about the pilot study, which perhaps we should put in quotes, but where did you get the funding for your pilot study?
Well, we didn't get any funding, in fact, and I was perfectly prepared to do it myself and would have been quite capable of doing it myself while maintaining the rest of my work. But fortunately, Dr. Ayo was keen to get experience in all things donor because she was about to take over as, I think, the director of the Malaysian Transfusion Service. So she was keen to muck in and did a lot of the heavy lifting, if you like, the phoning up of hospitals to try and find a set of notes and speak to the right person and that sort of thing. So effectively she became a liaison point between me and my secretary. Normally my secretary did a lot of that kind of administrative chasing up. But Yasmin and I was very happy to get in there and get to know the nuts and bolts, which was very nice for me.
And she, just to be clear, Dr. Ayoub was a visitor to the SEBTS, as you say, undertaking some training, understanding what happened at SEBTS before she returned to Malaysia.
That's right. She was there for a year.
In relation to Look Back coming to an end in 1998, if the Look Back was always in a state of flux with things coming in and going out, why was it brought to an end in 1998 if the picture was uncertain?
That is a misconception. It didn't come to an end. Of course, it continued if a newly HCV positive donor was identified in 2000, we would still have done the look back. And we'd still be doing it to this day if that arose. So in a sense, it's never ending.
What lessons do you think can be learnt about keeping records of donors and donor tracing to avoid the difficulties of tracing that were encountered in the look back?
I would like to think they've all been learned a long time ago. But I'm no expert on computerization, particularly as it is employed in patient settings. But I would hope that that is a problem that is now in the past. Can't do any more than hope.
In your evidence, you explained your contemporaneous view that it would be extremely difficult to test all frozen samples of blood, the archive samples for hepatitis C. You also acknowledged that offering tests to anyone who received a blood transfusion before testing wouldn't be very effective. In retrospect, what's your view about the decision not to test samples?
I think it was inevitable. That decision would have been made. It had the feel of messiness about it that would, I think the messiness would have arisen. I think there would have been samples missing, there would have been a suspicion of wrong samples. We would have used up some in previous investigations, a lot of them, in fact. In other words, there'd be all sorts of holes in the system that would have rumbled on and caused quite a lot of difficulty, quite apart from the resources it consumed. So, I don't know, I may be defending the indefensible, but I don't think so. I think it's something that was just too big.
Just before the break, we looked at an article you wrote in the sort of newsletter style about Look Back. At the start of that article, you referred to potential legal action. To what extent did you see that potential as being a deterrent from undertaking Look Back?
I'm sorry, there seemed to be a word that didn't come through there.
Let me try again. To what extent did you see the potential legal action as being seen as a deterrent for undertaking Look Back?
Not at all. That didn't come into my thinking at all.
Did it come into the thinking of other colleagues? Obviously, you undertook the pilot study, but in relation to your colleagues, where the decisions were made not to undertake Look Back, was the potential legal action a factor that was being discussed?
Not to my knowledge, but I wasn't on the relevant committees by that time. I don't remember it cropping up very much in discussions. But of course I wasn't present at many of the UK-wide discussions with the directors and so on.
And finally, you've said that you became responsible for the provision of cryoprecipitate in 2005. What use was still being made of cryoprecipitate at that stage?
I think by that stage it was really pretty much restricted to patients who had got into serious clotting difficulties as a result of very heavy transfusion during major surgery, major trauma, and so on. I can't remember any other particular situations where it was heavily used.
Thank you. Those are the questions I have. I'm just going to look behind me to see if there's anything further. No, sir.
Well, just a couple of questions. Going back to the question of being frank with donors, the training program that you've mentioned more than once, when you were you took the view in 1985 that what those who are running donor sessions should do is be upfront in a matter-of-fact way in asking the questions of the donors rather than jumping to assumptions about the donor.
Yes.
We've heard elsewhere in this inquiry about fears being expressed that a number of people might come to a donor session because it was a way of getting HIV tested without having an HIV test as such for well-known social reasons.
Yes.
That might mean that they had an incentive to be less than frank with the donor supervisor. How would that be dealt with? If the rule is take it from the individual, don't jump to assumptions, but you have a very strong suspicion that this is somebody who is in that category, or for that matter, someone you happen to see in the street beforehand holding hands with another man at a time when that wasn't familiar social behaviour, there might have been a suspicion that the answers that he gave about relationships with other men might not have been true. How was that to be dealt with?
Well, preemptively, predominantly, we hoped because it was foreseen very early on, again by Brian McClelland especially, in discussion with the gay groups in Scotland. And what he did was to manage to get, I can't remember exactly where the money came from, but he got funding, probably through the Lothian Health Board initially, for the establishment of a clinic at the City Hospital called the City Clinic, which is where the infectious disease unit was, and managed to get a lot of publicity through the gay groups themselves, including meetings where he and my predecessor, and latterly I myself, went along to some of these discussions, which were very interesting and very helpful, I think, for understanding on both sides. And they seem to be on board. They seem to be spreading the message in their own communities about not doing that in blood transfusion, but rolling up to the City Clinic, which was designed specifically for the purpose and was took great care of anonymity and so on. So it was foreseen. There were occasionally, it did come up at donor sessions, and I, like consultant colleagues across the UK, would occasionally have a donor referred for discussion from a session. I think if a donor attendant, it would probably not be at that level, but at nursing level, if a nurse had a serious problem with a donor, where there was a bit of an impasse where he or she, the nurse, felt that he or she, the donor, should not be donating, occasionally it would end up in an interview with me. And they weren't easy. They weren't easy. And they weren't always very straightforward, even after we'd had a long chat. I think my attitude was that it had to feel safe, and if it ended up with somebody stomping out in indignation, well, so be it. But it's easier said than done, I think.
Thank you. The other question really doesn't arise out of any questions which Council has put to you, but does arise from your witness statement. And just a matter of curiosity, really. You say in your witness statement that you knew about AIDS and its link to blood, perhaps, from the earliest days of the American experience and a first report in June 1981. At what time, do you think, did you feel that there were potentially repercussions for the transfusion service after that?
I would guess it was in 1982 when there was the report of the baby being infected. Whether there had been speculation in the medical press or any other press, I'm not sure. But certainly with that incident, when it became clear that it could be transfusion transmitted, I was aware of that. Being a bit of a news junkie, and I think we were all kind of news junkies at that stage.
Well, thank you very much. Sorry, you're going to add something.
I was just going to say maybe I had some suspicions before, but I really couldn't swear to that.
So you may have had suspicions before, but you're pretty clear that by the time, at any rate, of hearing about the baby at the end of '82, that would have been, you fear that there was a potential risk.
Yes.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Gillon, is there anything else you would like to add?
I don't think so. Thank you.
Well, can I say how really very grateful we are to you for giving your evidence. I have to say that you've come across as somebody who's has very strong ethical base for what they do and what they say, and as part of that, perhaps it's a reflection of that it seems to me that you've given us your unvarnished evidence as you see it, as you understand it, and expressed your views frankly and clearly. And may I say also, in what seems to be a kind and considerate manner to others, in particular the donors and the patients, that you had a responsibility to, as you put it, more than once. Thank you for doing what you may have seen as your responsibility to us, but we certainly see it as something to be grateful for. Thank you.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
Ms. Fraser-Butlin, tomorrow?
Tomorrow we'll be hearing from Dr. Martley.
So tomorrow, 10 o'clock, Dr. Martley.
Thank you.
Thank you.